They laughed when she stepped off the stage. Not quietly, not behind their hands. Openly, the way people laugh when they think they have the right. Martha Greer, the woman who ran Redstone Valley's only boarding house and fancied herself the gatekeeper of everything decent in town, leaned over to her neighbor and said it loud enough for half the street to hear. Lord help the man who ordered that. He asked for a wife and they sent him a draft horse. The laughter spread like a brush fire. Elara Voss stood in the dust of Redstone Valley's main street with a single trunk at her feet and $47 sewn into the hem of her coat, and she did not flinch. She had heard worse. She had survived worse. But something about the way Martha Greer's mouth curved, satisfied, almost hungry, made Elara's jaw tighten in a way she couldn't entirely control. She picked up her trunk, alone, because no one offered to help. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, take a moment and subscribe to the channel. Hit that bell so you never miss a story. And drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Elara Voss standing in the dirt of Redstone Valley, about to prove every single one of them wrong. She had not come to Redstone Valley because she wanted to. Nobody came to Redstone Valley because they wanted to. You came because you ran out of other options, or because someone with a fast tongue had described it as a place of opportunity, or because a letter had arrived in your hands that offered something you hadn't been offered before. Elara's letter had arrived on a Tuesday in late October. When the frost was already creeping under the door of the rented room, she shared with two other women in a rooming house in Harrisburg. The letter was short. It wasn't romantic. A man named Colton Ray, operating a cattle ranch in the Northern Territory, required a wife of practical disposition. He was not looking for companionship in the sentimental sense. He needed someone who could manage a household, assist with record-keeping, and weather hard conditions without complaint. He was 38 years old. He had been married once before. He did not elaborate on what had happened to his first wife. He had included a photograph. He was not a handsome man. His face was angular and weathered in the way of men who spent most of their lives outdoors, and his expression in the photograph was the expression of a man who found the act of sitting still for a photograph deeply irritating. He looked like someone who would be difficult to live with. Elara had read the letter twice. Then she had looked at her own reflection in the small, spotted mirror on the wall of that rented room. Her broad shoulders, her height, the fullness of her figure that had been the subject of so many jokes and so much quiet cruelty. And she had made a calculation. She wrote back the same afternoon. Her letter was also short. She listed her skills without apology. She had worked her family's farm from the age of 9 after her father's back gave out. She could read and write and do arithmetic. She knew something about animal husbandry, crop rotation, and the preservation of food stores for winter. She was not delicate. She was not afraid of silence or hard work. She was 29 years old and she had no illusions about herself or about what a frontier marriage was likely to involve. She did not mention how many other proposals she had not received. She did not mention the way men in Harrisburg looked through her at parties, as though she occupied space but not quite the right kind of space. She did not mention that her own mother, with the particular cruelty of someone who believed she was being honest, had told her at 17 that she would need to work twice as hard and want half as much as other women, because the world was not built for women who looked like her. She sealed the letter and mailed it before she could change her mind. His response came 3 weeks later. 2 words above his signature, "Come then." So she came. The stage from the rail junction dropped her in Redstone Valley at 2:30 on a Thursday afternoon, and within 4 minutes of her arrival, Martha Greer had made her assessment public. Elara set her trunk down in front of the general store and looked around. The town was smaller than she'd expected. A single main street with a dozen buildings crammed along it, the whole thing sitting at the foot of a ridge like it had been pushed there and hadn't bothered to move. The mountains beyond it were enormous and indifferent. The sky was a hard, pale blue. A man leaning against the post of the general store was watching her with the particular expression of someone who has nothing better to do and has decided that watching you is entertainment enough. "You the one going to the Ray Ranch?" he said. "I am," Elara said. He looked her over slowly. Not the way a man looks at a woman he finds attractive. The other way. The assessing, clinical way, like she was livestock. "Huh," he said finally, and went back to leaning on the post. She had been in Redstone Valley for less than 10 minutes. She went into the general store to ask about transport to the ranch, and the woman behind the counter, heavy-set, with small, sharp eyes, looked up and took her in and said, "You're the mail-order bride?" "I'm here to meet Colton Ray," Elara said. "That's what I said." The woman leaned on the counter. "He know you're this big?" The question landed the way such questions always landed, like a stone dropping into still water, the ripples spreading out before Elara had time to prepare for them. She felt the flush of heat rise in her face. She controlled it. She had years of practice at controlling it. "Is there a way to get a message to the ranch?" she said. "Or transport?" The woman stared at her for a moment longer, then straightened up. "Hiram Potts does the hauling. He'll be at the livery around 4. She paused. "You want some advice?" "No," Elara said. The woman gave her advice anyway. "Colton Ray is a hard man in a hard place. His first wife lasted 14 months. The cold alone will kill you if the loneliness doesn't. You seem like a sensible woman. There's still a stage back east tomorrow morning." "Thank you for the information about Hiram Potts," Elara said. She bought a tin of crackers and a jar of preserved peaches because she hadn't eaten since before dawn, and she went back outside to wait. Martha Greer was still on the street, still talking, her voice carrying easily in the dry air. She was holding court now. 3 or 4 women had gathered, and a couple of men on the fringe who were pretending not to listen, but were listening. "Colton's lost his mind, that's what," Martha was saying. "You write away for a wife, and you can't even be specific enough to make sure she'll fit through the door?" A ripple of laughter. "The poor man. He's already had enough trouble. Now he's got this to contend with." Elara sat on her trunk. She opened the tin of crackers. She ate one slowly. She had learned a long time ago that reacting was the thing they wanted. The laugh, the wounded look, the hot flush of shame. Those were the things that gave people like Martha Greer what they were after. Take that away and you had nothing left but a woman eating crackers on a trunk, which wasn't nearly as interesting. But inside, something harder than embarrassment was taking shape. She noted Martha Greer's face, her voice, the self-satisfied way she held her chin up when she spoke. Elara had a good memory for people who decided what she was worth before they knew anything about her. She filed it away. She ate another cracker. Hiram Potts was a small, dry, uncommunicative man who loaded her trunk into his wagon without comment and drove her north out of town without asking a single question about where she'd come from or why she was here. It was the most restful conversation she'd had all day. The land changed as they moved away from town. It opened up and got wilder, the scrub giving way to stands of pine and rock outcroppings that pushed up from the earth at odd angles. The road, if it could be called that, was really just 2 tracks where wagon wheels had worn the ground down over years of use. It wound through the hills with the casual indifference of something that had evolved rather than been planned. Elara watched it all. She was calculating, the way she always calculated. The soil type where the scrub was thinnest, the drainage patterns visible in the slope of the hillsides, the places where water would collect, and the places where it would run off. She did it without thinking. It was just how she processed landscape, not as scenery, but as a set of problems and possibilities. "How big is the Ray Ranch?" she asked Hiram. He thought about it. "About 4,000 acres. Could be more. Never been surveyed proper." "How many head of cattle?" He glanced at her sideways. "Last I heard, maybe 300, down from 450 2 years back." He paused. "Hard winters. Lost some in a canyon flood, too." She stored this. A ranch that had been contracting. A man managing a property in decline, dealing with losses he hadn't recovered from. She had known this was a possibility. The letter hadn't suggested prosperity, only a need for practical help. But hearing the numbers made it concrete. 300 head on 4,000 acres with winters that killed cattle. No margin for error. "What's the soil like north of here?" she asked. Hiram looked at her again with that sideways look. "Why?" "I'm curious." He seemed to decide this was an acceptable answer. "Clay heavy on the flats. Better up on the rises. Gets rocky fast up near the tree line." She nodded, thinking. They rode the rest of the way in quiet that was comfortable enough. The ranch house was not what she'd imagined, and she'd been careful not to imagine too much. It was large enough, 2 stories, built from thick timber, with a covered porch that ran along the front. but it had the look of something that had been built with ambition and then maintained with exhaustion. The porch railing on the left side had a gap where two boards had rotted and not been replaced. The barn behind the house was solid, but the fence running from it to the east pasture needed work. She could see it sagging in two places from 30 yards away. Colton Ray was standing on the porch when Hiram pulled up. He looked like his photograph in the way that a place looks like the description you've been given of it, recognizable, but more itself than the description had managed to convey. He was taller than she'd expected, with the kind of stillness that some men have that isn't peace so much as exhaustion, so deep it's become habitual. His hair was dark with some gray coming in at the temples. His hands, she noticed, were large and scarred. He looked at her. She looked at him. His expression did not change, but something moved behind his eyes, something she couldn't read yet. Not disappointment exactly, more like the look of a man recalibrating. "Miss Voss," he said. "Mr. Ray," she said. He came down the porch steps and took her trunk from the back of Hiram's wagon without waiting to be asked. "I'll show you the house," he said. That was all. No welcome, no pleasantries. He turned and walked up the steps and she followed him, and Hiram Potts turned his wagon around and headed back toward town without anyone saying goodbye. Inside, the house was cleaner than she'd expected. Not perfectly clean. There were dishes stacked near the sink that hadn't been washed, and the floor had the faint grime of a place where mud was tracked in regularly. But someone had made an effort. Recently. She suspected it had been a hasty effort made in the last day or two in anticipation of her arrival, and she found that oddly touching in a way she didn't let show. He showed her the kitchen first, then the front room, then the room he'd prepared for her. Small, with a single window that faced east, and a bed with a good heavy quilt that had seen years of use. The quilt was the most domestic thing in the house. She wondered who had made it. "The ranch hands eat in the bunkhouse," he said. "There are 4 of them. They don't come in the main house." He paused. "The kitchen is yours to manage if you're willing. I'm capable of cooking, but I don't have time for it most days." "That's fine," she said. "I'll need help with the account books. I'm not—" He stopped. "The numbers are fine. The recording of them isn't something I'm good at. Everything ends up in different places, and I can't find things when I need them." "I can organize that," she said. He looked at her steadily. "The work here is hard. I won't pretend otherwise. And the winters are—" He stopped again. "They're hard." "You've said hard twice," she said. Something crossed his face that wasn't quite a smile. "Because it's the right word." She looked around the kitchen. She looked at the stack of unwashed dishes, the account book sitting open on the table with numbers written in a cramped, uneven hand, the single window that let in the afternoon light. She looked at all of it as a set of problems. "I'll need to understand the layout of the property," she said. "The pasture rotation, the water sources, what you've been planting in the kitchen garden, and how much you've been getting from it. I'll need to look at those account books. And I'll want to talk to whoever manages the herd about what the plan is for winter feed." He stared at her. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. But the look on his face had shifted again. Still unreadable, mostly. But slightly. Only slightly. Less like a man expecting a problem, and more like a man who wasn't sure yet what he was looking at. "I'll start with the dishes," she said. "Then the account books. Then tomorrow you can show me the pastures." He nodded once. Then he went back outside. She stood in the kitchen for a moment by herself. She listened to the sound of the ranch. Distant cattle, wind moving against the eaves, the faint clank of something metal from the direction of the barn. The silence underneath all of it was enormous. She rolled up her sleeves. She found the soap. She started on the dishes. Outside, far to the north, the first clouds of what would become the worst winter in a decade were already building against the mountains, dark and immense, and entirely indifferent to the plans of the woman standing at the kitchen sink of the Ray Ranch, or the man walking back across his pasture, or the town full of people who had already decided what she was worth. The mountains did not care about any of that. The winter that was coming didn't care either. But Elara Voss was already calculating, and she had always been better at this than anyone gave her credit for. The dishes took her an hour, not because there were so many of them, but because the water had to be heated on the stove and the stove was burning low, and she had to find where he kept the wood, which turned out to be a pile behind the kitchen door, partially blocking it, stacked by someone who had been in a hurry and hadn't cared about the inconvenience to anyone coming through afterward. She moved the stack, She built the fire up properly. She heated the water and washed the dishes and set them to dry on a cloth she found folded in a drawer that also contained 3 mismatched spoons, a broken length of rope, and a folded piece of paper with numbers on it that turned out to be a feed calculation from 2 winters ago. She put the paper with the account book on the table. She would look at it later. By the time the dishes were done, the light outside had shifted to the long amber kind that meant late afternoon sliding toward evening, and she heard boots on the porch steps. And then Colton came back in through the back door with mud on his boots and his hat pushed back and the look of a man who had spent the last few hours solving a problem he was angry he'd had to deal with. He looked at the clean dishes. He didn't say anything. "I found this," she said, and held up the feed calculation paper. He took it, looked at it. "That's old." "I know, but whoever did it knew what they were doing. The margin calculation here," she pointed, "is sensible. Is that your handwriting?" "No." He set the paper down. "My first wife did the books." He said it flatly, the way you say something you've said enough times that the rawness of it has worn off, but the shape of it is still there. Elara didn't push. She'd heard the word first and understood what it cost him to say it that simply. "I'll make something for supper," she said instead. He nodded and went to wash up. She found salt pork, dried beans, half a sack of cornmeal, and a string of onions hanging near the back door. It wasn't much of an inventory for a working ranch. She made a note of that too. Not on paper yet, just in the part of her mind where she was accumulating the list of things that needed addressing. A list that was already longer than she'd anticipated. They ate at the kitchen table without much conversation. He ate the way men ate who were used to eating alone. Quickly, and without seeming to notice what they were tasting. She ate because she was hungry. Outside, the wind had come up, pressing against the walls of the house with a kind of casual persistence. "The fence on the east pasture," she said. "The section that runs from the barn out toward the ridge. It's sagging in at least 2 places." He looked up from his plate. "I noticed it coming in," she said. "If there's a hard push of cattle from the north pasture in bad weather, that section won't hold." A pause. "I know about the fence." "I'm not saying you don't." He was quiet for a moment. "I've got 4 men. I've got 300 head that need moving before the ground freezes, and I've got a section of the north watercourse that's been silting up since August. The fence is on my list." "I understand," she said. "I just wanted to make sure it was on the list." He looked at her. It was the same look as before, that careful, recalibrating look. "What do you know about cattle?" "Less than you," she said. "But I've worked stock. Hogs mostly, and some dairy cattle when I was younger. I know how animals behave in weather. This weather is different." "I expect it is." He pushed his plate back slightly and folded his hands on the table. "Miss Voss?" he said, and then stopped. "Elara," she said. Another pause. "Elara, I want to be direct with you. Please. I put out that advertisement because I needed help. Practical help. I'm not looking for..." He seemed to be choosing his words with the care of a man walking across uncertain ground. "I don't have much to offer beyond the work. The ranch isn't what it was. I've had some hard years. The arrangement I proposed, I meant it plainly. A partnership of function. That's what I need." She looked at him steadily. "That's what I agreed to. I want to make sure you understood that before you..." He gestured vaguely at the house, at the situation, at all of it. "Mr. Ray," she said, "I read your letter very carefully. I wrote back because I understood it precisely. I didn't come here expecting sentiment or comfort. I came here because it's a better situation than the one I was in, and because I believe I can be useful to you. That's all." He studied her face. She held his gaze because looking away would have cost her something she wasn't willing to give up. "Colton," he said finally. "What?" "If I'm to call you Elara, you should call me Colton." "All right," she said. He picked up his fork again. She did the same. The wind kept pressing at the walls. The first week was mostly about learning the geography of the place. Not just the land, but the human landscape of it, which was often harder to read. The 4 ranch hands were named Denny, Chalk, Ord, and a young man everyone called Fetch, for reasons she never entirely got to the bottom of. Denny was the eldest, somewhere in his 50s, with a face like a topographic map and the slow, deliberate speech of someone who had learned that most things didn't require a fast answer. Chalk was 30-ish and suspicious of her from the first moment she appeared in the yard, watching her with eyes that never quite warmed up even when the rest of him relaxed. Ord was cheerful and not particularly bright, which made him easy to work around. Fetch was 19 and so eager to be liked that he tripped over himself trying to help her carry things she hadn't asked for help carrying. She didn't try to make friends of them. That wasn't the point. She paid attention to how they worked, what they knew, where the inefficiencies were in the daily operation. She did this quietly, moving around the edges of the ranch's activity for the first 3 days without offering opinions. On the 4th day, she looked at the kitchen garden, which was mostly bare earth with the remnants of what had been a mediocre summer crop, and started thinking about next season. On the 5th day, she sat down with the account books. They were, as Colton had suggested, a mess. Not because the numbers were wrong, she could see that the arithmetic was accurate, but because the logic of organization was missing. Expenses recorded in one book, income in another, with a third loose collection of receipts and bills of sale stuffed into the back of a cabinet. No running summary. No way to look at any given month and understand at a glance whether the ranch was gaining or losing ground. She spent 2 evenings sorting and reorganizing. By the end of the 2nd evening, she had a clear picture of the ranch's finances, and it was not a comfortable picture. 3 consecutive difficult winters had eaten into reserves that had never been rebuilt. The cattle losses 2 years ago had been worse than Hiram had let on, closer to 120 head than 60 or 70. The ranch was functional, but it was running on a narrower margin than Colton probably admitted to himself, because sometimes the only way to keep going is to look slightly to the side of the full truth. She thought about how to tell him this. She didn't think about whether to tell him. That wasn't a question. She found him in the barn on the evening of the 6th day, working on a piece of harness with the concentrated unhappiness of someone doing a repair job they'd put off too long. "I finished with the account books," she said. "And?" He didn't look up. "And you need to know some things." He set the harness down. She told him plainly, not brutally, but plainly, the way she would have wanted someone to tell her. The reserves, the margin, the pattern of expenditure that made sense for a larger operation but was slow bleeding for one this size. She laid it out in sequence, which was the only way it made sense. He listened without interrupting. His face had the still closed quality of a man taking a blow he'd been half expecting. When she finished, the barn was very quiet except for the movement of one of the horses shifting its weight in its stall. "I know it's not worse than you suspected," she said, "but I wanted you to have the numbers in front of you rather than around the edges." "No," he said, "it's worse than I suspected." He was quiet for a moment. "What would you do?" The question surprised her, not that he'd asked it, but the directness of it. He wasn't hedging, wasn't prefacing it with, "You're just the," or "I don't expect you to understand." He just asked it. Reduce the overhead on winter feed by cutting the herd slightly now. Sell the weakest 15 or 20 head while prices are still reasonable, rather than carrying them through winter and losing them anyway. Use what you get from that to fix the east fence properly and put something back into the kitchen garden infrastructure. Renegotiate the supply arrangement with whoever you're buying grain from. I saw the price in the books, and it's high for the volume you're purchasing, which means you're either buying from someone who's taking advantage of the distance, or you haven't checked the going rate recently. He stared at her. "I could be wrong about some of it," she said. "The herd decisions especially. You know these animals, and I don't. But the supply renegotiation I'm confident about." "How do you know the grain price is high?" "My father ran a farm in Ohio for 20 years. I learned prices the way other girls learned recipes." He picked up the harness again, turned it over in his hands without actually doing anything with it. "The man I buy grain from is Jonas Aldrich. He's in town. He paused. "He's not someone you negotiate with easily." "Who is he?" "He owns the grain supply, the feed store, and 3 sections of land east of here that he's been pushing to expand. He's been after me to sell for 2 years." This was new information. She filed it carefully. A man who controlled supply and wanted land. That was a particular kind of leverage, the quiet kind, the kind that didn't look like pressure until you sat down with the numbers and saw how the weight of it had been building. "And the price keeps going up," she said. It wasn't a question. Colton's jaw shifted slightly. "Every season. Incrementally, small enough each time to seem like inflation. He set the harness down again. Yes. She thought for a moment. Do you have any other source for grain in a reasonable distance? There's a mill operation about 40 miles southeast, Henderson's. I've bought from them before, but Aldrich gave me better terms 3 years ago, so I switched. What terms? Credit through the winter, pay in spring after sales season. She understood it immediately. The credit arrangement that seemed like a favor and was actually a chain, you became dependent on it, and then the price crept up year by year, because where else would you go when you owed a balance? She had seen her father caught in a similar arrangement with a seed supplier once, and it had taken him 2 seasons and considerable stubbornness to work his way out of it. I'd like to write to Henderson's, she said. If you're willing. He looked at her, that recalibrating look again, more complicated this time. You've been here 6 days. I know. You're already... He seemed to be choosing his words again. You're moving fast. If I'm wrong, you can ignore the letter, but the inquiry costs nothing. A long pause. Then, write the letter. She wrote it that night, at the kitchen table, by lamplight, while the wind moved around the house in the particular way it had here. Not the gusting directional wind she'd known in Ohio, but something more persistent, more all-encompassing, like the land was breathing. She was precise in the letter. She asked about pricing for bulk grain purchase, payment terms, and delivery capacity for the northern ranching area. She didn't mention Aldrich. She didn't need to. She sealed it and left it on the table for Colton to look at in the morning. Then she sat for a moment in the quiet kitchen, and she thought about Jonas Aldrich. She thought about the way Colton had said his name. Careful, like you're careful around something that has weight and sharp edges. She thought about the letter he'd used to describe the arrangement, better terms. The way good terms became bad ones, slowly, so slowly that by the time you recognized them for what they were, you'd been paying the difference for years. She had only been here 6 days. She didn't know this place. She didn't know these people. She was aware of the risk of moving fast on incomplete information, but she was also aware that the woman in town, Martha Greer, with her open laugh and her loud assessment, represented something. Not just personal cruelty, but a broader certainty shared by everyone in Redstone Valley that Elara Voss was a temporary problem, an awkwardness, something that wouldn't stick. They were all waiting for her to fail, to fold, to get back on the eastbound stage with her trunk and her tail between her legs. She was not going to do that. She blew out the lamp and went to bed, and she lay in the dark listening to the wind and the faint sound of cattle in the distant pasture, and she ran numbers in her head until sleep took her. What? The second week introduced her to Jonas Aldrich, though not in the way she'd expected. He came to the ranch on a Wednesday, unannounced, arriving in a fine wagon with a hired driver, which was already a statement. Nobody used a hired driver in this territory unless they wanted you to notice that they could afford one. He was a large man, not in height, but in presence, with a broad, florid face and the kind of easy, practiced smile that Elara recognized immediately as the smile of someone who had learned that appearing friendly was a more efficient tool than appearing threatening. She was in the yard when he arrived, talking to Denny about the South Pasture's drainage situation, a conversation that had been going on in an unsatisfying circular fashion for about 10 minutes because Denny's approach to the drainage problem was essentially to hope it resolved itself. Aldrich pulled up, and his driver set the brake, and Aldrich climbed down with the practiced ease of a man performing a routine he'd performed many times. He looked around the yard. He looked at Denny. Then he looked at Elara, and his face did the thing faces sometimes did when they encountered her. A fractional pause, a recalculation, before the smile came back, broader and slightly adjusted. "This must be Mrs. Ray," he said. "Miss Voss," she said. "Mr. Ray isn't married yet. Is he expecting you?" The adjustment in his smile was microscopic, but she caught it. He hadn't expected to be corrected. "I don't generally need an appointment with Colton," he said pleasantly. "Old friends don't stand on ceremony." She could have gone to find Colton. That would have been the obvious move, the deferential one. Instead, she stayed where she was. "He's out on the north section. He'll be back mid-afternoon. Then I pass along a message?" "I'd rather wait, if that's all the same." He was still smiling. "Get some business sorted." "Of course," she said. "Denny, we'll finish this later." She looked at Aldrich. "There's coffee inside." She gave him coffee, and she sat across from him at the kitchen table while he waited, and she watched the way his eyes moved around the kitchen. Not casually, but with the measuring look of a man who is accounting for things. The account books were not visible. She'd put them away. The letter to Henderson's was long since gone with the postal rider on Monday. There was nothing to read in the kitchen except a woman who seemed entirely comfortable meeting his eyes, which appeared to disconcert him more than the account books would have. "You've come a long way to be out here," he said. His tone was genial. "From back east?" "Pennsylvania," she said. "Long way," he said again. "Must be quite a change." "It's different," she said. "Colton's a good man," Aldrich said. "Hard years lately. I've tried to help where I could." The smile again. "That's what neighbors do." "That's kind of you," she said pleasantly. He looked at her steadily for a moment, still smiling, and she had the distinct impression that they were having two conversations simultaneously. The surface one, which was perfectly civil, and the one underneath, where he was figuring out what she was, and she was figuring out what he was. She already knew what he was, but she let him think she was still working on it. When Colton came back and found Aldrich at his kitchen table, something crossed his face, a tension, quickly controlled. He shook the man's hand with the careful warmth of someone managing a relationship they have complicated feelings about. They went outside to talk, which was fine. She wasn't trying to hear the conversation. She already had the information she needed. She started on the dinner preparations. 15 minutes later, Denny appeared in the kitchen doorway, which was unusual. The hands didn't come into the main house. He stood in the doorway like he wasn't sure if he was allowed past it. "What is it?" she said without turning from the stove. "Nothing," he said. Then, "Aldrich is offering to buy 20 head, at a fair price." She stirred the pot. "Is he?" "Colton's thinking on it." She kept her voice level. "That's Colton's decision." A pause from the doorway. "He's been thinking on taking that north section land off Colton's hands too. Says it's more trouble than it's worth with the silt problem. Good neighbor offer." She turned around. Denny was watching her with the careful eyes of someone delivering information without knowing exactly why they felt the need to deliver it. "The north section with the silt problem," she said. "Yes, ma'am. That's where the upper watercourse runs. If you clear the silt problem, that whole section becomes the best watered ground on this property." She paused. "That's why it's more trouble than it's worth to Colton, and also why a good neighbor wants to help him be rid of it." Denny's weathered face was very still. "I thought something like that," he said slowly, "but I don't always trust my own thinking." "Your thinking is fine," she said, and turned back to the stove. She heard him leave. She stood at the stove and thought about Jonas Aldrich and his fine wagon and his practiced smile and his long, patient strategy for acquiring land from a man who was too tired and too stretched to see the shape of it clearly. She thought about what to do, and more importantly, what not to do yet. She was still new here. She had no standing in this community. Colton barely knew her. She couldn't walk out onto the porch and tell a man she'd met 3 hours ago that his neighbor was slowly picking him apart, because she had no established credibility from which to say it, and every reason for him to dismiss it as a newcomer overstepping. She needed time, and she needed Colton to trust her enough to listen. Neither of those things existed yet. When Aldrich left an hour later, Colton came inside and sat at the table and didn't say anything for a moment. "He offered to buy 20 head, he said. Denny mentioned it." "Did he?" Colton's voice was neutral, but something in it had an edge. He looked at her. "You talk to Denny often?" "He came to the kitchen door. I didn't ask him to." A beat. "The price Aldrich offered is fair, slightly better than fair even." She sat down across from him. But he also offered to take the north section off my hands, at a reasonable price." He said the word reasonable the way people say a word they're not sure they believe. "Silt problem makes it more of a burden than a benefit," he said. She kept her face neutral. "What did you tell him?" "That I'd think on it." He rubbed his face with one hand. "I've got more to manage than I've got men or money for. That section has been nothing but trouble since the watercourse started backing up. It'd free up capital. May I ask something?" He nodded. "When the watercourse is working properly, before the silt problem, what was that section worth?" He was quiet for a long moment. "It was the best ground on the property." "What would it cost to clear the silt problem?" Another pause. Longer. "I don't know exactly. It's not a small job. But you'd know better than I would whether it's a solvable problem or a permanent one." He looked at the table. He had the look of a man turning something over that he hadn't been turning over directly before, but looking at a thing he'd been seeing from the side and now seeing from straight on. "It's solvable," he said slowly. "It's just—" He stopped. "It's just that you don't have the time or the capital right now." "No." She let the silence sit for a moment. "You don't have to decide anything about the north section this week. He'll come back with another offer if I don't." "Let him," she said. "The longer you wait, the more you learn about how much he wants it." He looked up at her. She realized she'd said more than she'd intended. She'd meant to be careful, to be gradual, to not push past the space she'd actually earned yet. But the logic of it had been sitting right there, and it had come out. "You think he wants it for a specific reason," Colton said. She made a decision. Slow was better, but not if slow meant watching someone sell the best ground on his property because she'd been too cautious to speak plainly. "The upper watercourse runs through the north section," she said. "If someone owns that section and clears the silt problem, they control the water supply for everything downstream, including your south pastures." The silence this time was of a different quality. She watched his face. He wasn't angry. He was doing what she did, thinking, calculating, assembling a picture from pieces he'd had for a while but hadn't assembled in this particular configuration. "He's been pushing on that north section for 2 years, he said quietly. "How long has the silt problem been building?" His jaw tightened. "About 2.5 years. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. He stood up abruptly and went to the window and stood there for a minute with his back to her. She waited. Outside, the last light was going from the sky, the mountains going dark against it, the cold settling down over the ranch the way it did every evening now, with a little more weight than the day before. When he turned around, his face had the quality of someone who has just seen something they can't unsee. "I need to think," he said. "Of course. This is— you might be reading something into—" "I might be," she said. "I've been here 9 days. I could be completely wrong." He looked at her. She held his gaze. "But you don't think you are," he said. "No," she said. "I don't." He was quiet for a long time. The fire in the stove ticked and popped. From somewhere in the distance, one of the cattle made a low carrying sound. "I'll tell him I need more time," he said finally. "That's all I was going to suggest." He nodded once, shortly, and went back outside. She heard his boots on the porch steps. She heard him walking across the yard in the dark. She sat at the kitchen table and breathed. She had been here 9 days. She had reorganized the accounts, identified a pricing problem with the grain supply, recognized a land acquisition strategy in the neighbor's generosity, and was now in the position of having told a man she barely knew that someone he'd trusted for years might be working against him. Any of those things could blow up in her face. All of them could. She was tired in a way that went deeper than physical exhaustion. The particular tiredness of spending all day reading the room, measuring every word, calculating every move in a situation where she had no margin for error, and where the wrong step would confirm everything Martha Greer and the rest of Redstone Valley already believed about her. She was also, underneath the tiredness, something else, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not quite satisfaction, too early for that, but the particular alertness that came from a problem that was actually worth solving, and the understanding that she was probably the person best positioned to solve it. She wasn't the draft horse they'd laughed at on the street. She wasn't Colton's fragile delivery from back east who'd fold at the first hard wind. She was a woman sitting alone in a kitchen at the edge of the frontier, adding things up, and she was fairly good at it. She got up, added wood to the stove, and started planning what she was going to say when the letter from Henderson's mill arrived. Outside, the clouds that had been building against the northern mountains for days were thickening, dense and dark and low, carrying the kind of cold that didn't negotiate. The hands had been talking about it in the yard, that particular edge in the air, the way the animals were restless. Denny had said that morning, without emphasis, that they were going to get weather. He didn't say it the way you talk about ordinary weather. He said it the way men in this territory said it when they meant something else entirely, something that required a different word, but that nobody had found yet because the ordinary word, weather, was the only one they had. The cold was coming, the real cold. And Elara Voss, 9 days into a life she'd chosen with both eyes open, was already calculating what it would cost them if they weren't ready. The letter from Henderson's mill arrived on a Friday, 11 days after Elara had sent her inquiry, carried by the postal rider who came through the Northern Territory twice a week, and who handed it over with the incurious efficiency of someone who had long since stopped wondering about other people's correspondence. She read it at the kitchen table while the morning porridge was still on the stove. Henderson's pricing was 14% lower than what Colton was currently paying Aldrich. Their payment terms were straightforward, half on order, half on delivery, no credit arrangements, no carried balances. Their delivery capacity to the northern ranching area was limited to twice per season, which was a real constraint, but a manageable one if you planned the order sizes correctly. She folded the letter and put it in her apron pocket. She served the porridge. She waited until Colton had finished his first cup of coffee because she had learned in 11 days that he was not a man who processed new information well before the first cup of coffee, and then she put the letter on the table in front of him. He read it without speaking. His face did the thing it did when he was thinking, a stillness that wasn't blankness but concentration, the way still water isn't empty, just deep. 14%, he said, on the current volume. More if you increase the order size, which you'd need to do given the twice-seasonal delivery schedule. She sat across from him. I worked out the numbers last night. If you order at the volume needed to cover both delivery gaps, the per-unit cost comes down another 4%. Net saving over a full year, even accounting for the larger upfront payment, is close to what you'd get from selling 20 head. He looked up from the letter. Without selling the cattle. Without selling the cattle. He set the letter down on the table carefully, the way you set something down when you're not sure what to do with it yet. Aldrich is going to know. Yes, she said. He will. He's not going to take it quietly. I expect not. She kept her voice even. But you'd be paying a fair price for your grain, and you wouldn't owe him a balance. Those are things worth having regardless of how he takes it. I was quiet for a long moment. Outside, Fetch was crossing the yard with a water bucket, his breath making small clouds in the cold air. The temperature had been dropping for a week in a steady, purposeful way that had no bottom to it yet. I'll think on it, Colton said. She nodded and took her porridge bowl to the sink. She knew he would do more than think on it. She had seen enough of him by now to understand how his decisions worked. Slowly, like a wheel that was hard to start turning, but that once moving was difficult to stop. He wasn't impulsive, and he wasn't a coward. He was a man who had been managing alone for long enough that he'd gotten cautious about moving, because every move he'd made in the last few years had cost him something. What he needed, she thought, was a run of moves that didn't. She was right about Aldrich. 10 days after Colton sent his order to Henderson's mill, a letter that Elara had drafted and Colton had revised twice before sending, adding and then removing and then adding again a line about appreciating the past business relationship, which told her more about how much Colton disliked conflict than anything else had. Aldrich arrived again. This time, there was no pretense of a social call. He pulled up in his wagon, climbed down, and walked directly to where Colton was working near the barn without looking around for anyone else. His face had changed. The practiced geniality was still there at the surface, but the surface was thinner now, and underneath it was something harder and less patient. Elara was on the porch. She stayed there. She couldn't hear the words from that distance, but she didn't need to. She could read the conversation in the body language. Aldrich's wide-planted stance, the way his hands moved when he talked. The finger pointed once at Colton's chest. Colton standing still and straight with his arms at his sides, his face doing the closed, controlled thing it did when he was holding something back. Not backing up. Not leaning in. Just standing there, which was its own kind of statement. It went on for about 12 minutes. Then Aldrich climbed back into his wagon, said something to his driver, and the wagon turned and went back down the track toward town, fast enough that the wheels threw up small stones. Colton stood where he was for a moment. Then he came toward the house. He passed her on the porch without stopping and went inside. She followed. He stood at the kitchen window with his back to her, looking out at nothing. "You all right?" she said. He said I'd regret it. His voice was flat. The credit arrangement, he said there were conditions to it that I'd apparently agreed to, and that switching suppliers without notice was a violation of those conditions. She felt something cold move through her. Is that in writing? He turned around. His face was doing something complicated. There's a paper somewhere, from 3 years ago when we set up the arrangement. I haven't looked at it recently. Where is it? They found it in the cabinet where the old receipts had been, the same cabinet she'd cleared out when she reorganized the accounts. She had put the older documents in a box on the shelf without going through them in detail because she'd been focused on the recent years. The paper was folded into a letter from Aldrich's feed store, dated 3 years and 2 months ago. She read it standing at the kitchen table while Colton watched her face. It was written in the pleasant, imprecise language of a man who had been doing this long enough to know how to make a trap look like a handshake. The credit arrangement was genuine. The terms of repayment were reasonable. And then, in the fourth paragraph, written in the same unhurried tone as everything else, in consideration of the extended credit terms herein, Ray Ranch agrees to maintain Henderson's feed and supply as its primary grain and feed supplier for a period no less than 5 years from the date of this agreement, with any termination of this arrangement requiring 60 days written notice and settlement of all outstanding balances in full prior to the effective date of termination. 5 years. They were in year 3. She set the paper down. He has another 2 years, she said, unless you give 60 days written notice and pay the full balance outstanding. She thought for a moment. What's the current balance? Colton's jaw was very tight. About $240. $240 was not a catastrophic sum, but it wasn't nothing either. Not for a ranch running on the margins the accounts had revealed. She sat down. She looked at the paper again. She looked at the language of it, at the way it had been drafted to seem like nothing until it needed to be something. "Did you have anyone look at this before you signed it?" she said. "No." He said it simply, without defensiveness. "He was offering me credit I needed in a bad year. It looked like what he said it was." She nodded. She didn't say anything further about how it had looked, because there was no useful purpose in it. The paper existed. The terms existed. The question now was what to do about them. "You can honor the notice period," she said. 60 days written notice, pay down the balance, and then switch to Henderson's. That's legal. That's exactly what the paper allows. 60 days is... He stopped. "It's winter." "Yes. I can't get Henderson's delivery before spring regardless." "Also yes." She traced the edge of the paper with one finger without thinking about it. "But you can send the written notice now. That starts the clock. By the time the 60 days are up, you'll have made one more purchase from Aldrich at his price. One purchase. And then you're free of it." He looked at her steadily. "And the balance?" "Write it to Henderson's when you place the spring order. Account for it in the order size calculation." She paused. "It'll be tight for a month, but it's workable." He sat down heavily in the chair across from her. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the day's physical labor. He looked like a man who had just seen the last 3 years of his life slightly differently than he'd seen them before, and the new view was not comfortable. "He's been doing this a while," Colton said. It wasn't quite a question. "The land offers, the supply arrangement, the north section." She kept her voice neutral. "He's patient and he's systematic. That's not something you come up with on short notice." Colton looked at the table. "I've known Jonas Aldrich for 8 years. She didn't respond to that because there was nothing she could say about it that would help. Some losses were just losses. Not of money or land, but of the simpler, more durable thing, the belief that you knew who someone was. After a while, he said, "Draft the notice letter. I'll sign it this afternoon." The blizzard announced itself the way the worst things do. Not all at once, but in pieces, each piece individually ignorable, until suddenly you'd been ignoring pieces for too long and the whole was upon you. Denny had been saying for 2 weeks that the weather was going to break bad. He said it without dramatics, which was how Elara had learned to take Denny's observations seriously. He wasn't a man who performed concern. When he said a thing, he said it because he believed it, and he had been reading this sky and this land for 30 years. By the 3rd week of November, the signs were undeniable. The cattle were pressing together in the pastures without being driven to. The horses were restless in a continuous, low-grade way. The temperature dropped 6 degrees in 2 days and kept going. The clouds that had been building in the north for weeks had moved down and sat on the mountains like a lid. Elara had spent the previous week working on the supply inventory. Not because anyone asked her to, but because she'd done the calculation of what they had against what a hard winter would require, and she'd been short on the right side of the ledger. She'd gotten the kitchen garden infrastructure reinforced against heavy snow. She'd worked with Fetch to improve the insulation on the chicken coop because they had 14 hens and those eggs would matter in February. She'd renegotiated the household supply order through a contact in Redstone Valley, not Aldrich's store, a dry goods operation run by a woman named Cora Fitch, who seemed surprised to be negotiated with but not unhappy about it. She had also quietly talked to Denny about the North Watercourse. Clearing the silt properly is a spring job, he'd told her. Too much frozen ground now. But there's a temporary measure. If you redirect the flow here, he'd sketched it in the dirt with a stick. It won't solve it, but it'll keep it from backing up worse through the winter. Might save the North Pasture water supply. How long would it take? Half a day with 2 men. Could you do it without taking the men off the cattle work? He'd thought about it. Saturday. She'd told Colton about it that evening. He'd listened, looked at Denny's dirt sketch that she'd reproduced on paper, and nodded. Do it Saturday. That was how most of their conversations about the ranch had started working. She brought the information, he made the call. He knew the land and the animals and the people in ways she didn't yet. She saw the systems and the numbers in ways he'd stopped seeing them. It wasn't a perfect arrangement. There were moments when he bristled, when she pushed past what he was ready to hear, when she said something and watched his face close like a door. But he never dismissed her outright, and she was learning to pace herself better. They were not close, not in any warm sense. They were 2 people managing a difficult situation with more cooperation than either had expected to manage. That was real, even if it wasn't comfortable. The blizzard arrived on a Sunday night. It didn't start dramatically. It started as snow, which was ordinary, and cold, which was also ordinary, and then sometime in the middle of the night, the wind came up and the temperature dropped with a violence that woke Elara out of sleep as surely as a noise would have. She lay in the dark and listened to the house. The walls were doing something they hadn't done before, not creaking exactly, but a kind of deep, pressured sound, like the cold outside was leaning on them deliberately. She got up and dressed in the dark. She went to the kitchen window. She couldn't see the barn. It was 30 yards away and she couldn't see it. She stood at the window for a full minute. The cold was coming through the glass in a way she could feel from a foot away. She put her hand on the wall beside the window frame, and the wall was cold enough that she pulled her hand back. This was a different category of weather than she had known. She built the kitchen fire up high and started heating water and waited for dawn, which came slowly, gray and without warmth, revealing a world that had been rearranged in the night. The snow was not falling so much as moving horizontally, driven by a wind that had found its purpose and intended to keep it. The drifts against the barn wall were already chest height. The track to the road was gone. Colton appeared in the kitchen doorway, already dressed, his face carrying the particular expression of a man looking at something he's prepared for, but hoped not to see. "How are the cattle?" she said. "Haven't been out yet." He went to the window. "Right. We moved them to the lower shelter last week. It's the north group I'm worried about. There's a box canyon up there they get into in bad weather. Gets sheltered, but if the snow's heavy enough, they can get trapped." "How many head in the north group?" 60, 65. She looked at the window, at the white moving nothing beyond it. "How do you get to them?" "Track goes along the ridge," he said it flatly. "In this, it's going to be buried. Could you find it?" He looked at her. "I know the land, but it's 3 miles in this wind." He stopped. "I'd need someone with me. You can't go out in this alone." He went to wake the hands. What came back from the bunkhouse 20 minutes later was, Ord had a fever that had been building since yesterday, which none of them had mentioned because Ord didn't complain and the others didn't think it was their business to report. Fetch had gone to town on Saturday to get supplies and had not come back, which meant he was either sheltering somewhere in Redstone Valley or, she watched Colton's face when this was said, something else. Chalk was present and able, and Denny was present and able, but Denny was moving with the careful deliberateness of someone whose joints were objecting strongly to the cold, which meant he was functional but not fast. Colton looked at his available force. 2 men, one of whom was slowing in the cold, and a 3-mile track through a blizzard to 60 head of cattle in a box canyon that might already be trapping them. "I'll come," Elara said. He looked at her. "I can follow a track, I can manage a rope. I'm not afraid of the cold." She met his eyes. "You need 3 people minimum for that kind of ground in this weather, and you have 2. I'm the 3rd. "You've never been on that ridge." "No, but you have." I'll stay close and do what you tell me. He was going to say no. She could see it forming. The automatic response, the protection instinct that had nothing to do with her actual capability and everything to do with a man's reflexes about what women were for and what they weren't for. Colton, she said. The cattle. He looked at the window, at the moving white wall of it. Wrap up everything you have, he said. Layers. Start with wool. They went out into it at 8:30 in the morning, the three of them, Colton leading, then Elara, then Chalk at the back, roped together at 10-foot intervals with the ranch's heaviest line. Denny stayed behind to manage Ord and keep the fires going, and she suspected to manage the very real possibility that they would need someone functional at the ranch if things went badly on the ridge. The cold hit her like a physical object, not the cold she'd known in Pennsylvania, which was cold in the ordinary sense of the word. This was something else, something that found the edges of her clothing immediately and pressed on them, looking for ways in. She tucked her chin down and pulled the scarf higher and focused on Colton's back 6 feet ahead of her. The wind made hearing difficult. The snow made seeing difficult. She kept her eyes on the dark shape of Colton moving in front of her and put her feet where the ground felt solid and tried not to think about how quickly the conditions could make that distinction irrelevant. The first quarter-mile was across open ground and was the worst of it. Nothing to break the wind, the drifts unpredictable. Twice she went into snow past her knee and had to pull herself out by leaning forward with the momentum she had. The rope between her and Colton was taut. She kept it taut. That was the rule he'd stated before they left. Keep the rope taut, don't let slack develop, because slack meant he couldn't feel you, and couldn't feel you meant you were in trouble. She kept it taut. The second quarter-mile climbed, which was better in terms of wind. The ridge itself provided some shelter, and worse in terms of footing. The rock under the snow was uneven and she slipped twice, catching herself both times with her weight and her core in the way her father had taught her when she was 12 and working in icy barn conditions. Don't fight the slip, use your weight as ballast, get low. It worked. She didn't fall. From behind her she could hear Chalk breathing hard, and occasionally a sound that might have been cursing but was torn apart by the wind before she could parse it. Halfway up the ridge, Colton stopped. She pulled up beside him. He was looking at the ground, or where the ground should have been. The track had disappeared, not just covered by snow, but fully absorbed into a drift that ran from the rock face on the left to the sharp drop on the right. A featureless white wall. How wide is the drop? She called to him, her voice barely carrying the 3 feet between them. 12 feet down to rock, then another 8 to the slope. He was studying the drift. The track curves right about 10 feet in. If I can find the curve, I can find the edge. She looked at the drift. It was shoulder high in places. You can't feel a track through that. I can't see it either. He turned to her. Something in his face that she hadn't seen before, not fear exactly, but a kind of honest uncertainty. The cattle are another 1.5 miles. She looked at the drift. She looked at the drop on the right. She thought about the way drifts formed, wind patterns, obstacles, how snow accumulated against vertical surfaces versus horizontal ones. She looked at the rock face on the left. The rock face, she said. The drift is against it. But if the track curves right, then the track runs away from the rock face. The drift builds against the obstacle and drops off where the obstacle ends. She pointed. The track should be here, where the drift is shallower, where the rock face ends. He looked where she was pointing. Try the edge of the drift on the left side, she said, 4 feet from the rock face. If the curve is there, you'll feel the packed ground. He moved to where she'd indicated. Pressed down with his foot. Moved 3 feet to the right. Pressed again. He looked back at her. His eyes above the scarf held something she hadn't seen from him yet. There, he said. They went on. The cattle were in canyon as he'd feared, and as she'd been calculating problems the whole way up, a new one was already apparent before they reached the canyon mouth. The narrow entrance was drifting closed. Not closed yet. There was still 6 feet of clearance at the top, but the drift was building from the left side, and another hour of this wind would close it to the point where cattle couldn't be moved through it. 60 head of cattle, trapped in a box canyon, running out of entrance. Colton looked at the drift closing the canyon mouth. He looked at Chalk. He looked at Elara. We have to move them now, he said. All of them, through that gap, before it closes further. Through this wind, Chalk said. He wasn't being difficult. It was a genuine question with a genuine problem in it. Moving cattle in blizzard conditions, through a narrowing gap, down a ridge track they'd nearly lost on the way up. "What choice is there?" Colton said. "None." There was none. She looked at the situation. 3 people, 60 cattle, a narrowing gap, a wind that was actively hostile to the plan. "The cattle are going to go the wrong direction," she said. "In this wind, they'll push back into the canyon. You need something behind them that's more frightening than the wind." "We don't have dogs," Chalk said. "No," she thought. "But you have noise and pressure. If all 3 of us are behind them and we're loud enough and we push the first 10 hard enough, the rest will follow because they're already packed together and there's nowhere else to go." She paused. "The risk is the gap. We need someone at the gap to guide the lead animals through it rather than letting them pile into the drift on the left side." Colton looked at the gap, looked at her. "If you're at the gap, I'll be fine. The drift on the left of it is unstable. If it shifts, then I'll move. I can read a drift." She met his eyes. "You and Chalk know how to move cattle. Put me at the gap, and you 2 work the herd." He didn't waste time arguing. "Stay to the right side of the gap. If the drift moves, go right, go down, and call out." "Understood." She took her position at the right side of the gap, 6 feet back from the drift, where she could see the opening and the herd beyond it, and the 2 dark figures of Colton and Chalk beginning to work the cattle from the rear. The wind screamed through the gap at her like something with a grudge. The cattle were not cooperative. They were frightened and cold, and they had the particular stubbornness of large animals that have decided the situation is bad and the solution is to not move. The first minutes were chaos, bellowing, pushing back, 2 animals breaking left toward the canyon wall before Chalk cut them off. She watched from the gap and held her position and kept her eyes on the leaders, the front animals, waiting for the moment the pressure from behind became greater than the resistance at the front. It took longer than she'd expected. Her feet had gone from cold to painful to something below painful that she tried not to think about. The wind had found the gap in her scarf and was working on her neck. The drift to her left made a sound she didn't like, a settling, internal sound, and she moved 2 feet to the right without looking away from the herd. Then the lead animal, a big dark-sided cow that had been standing her ground for 5 full minutes, took 1 step forward, then another. When the lead animal moves, the rest begin to follow. It's not thought, it's pressure. The accumulated weight of 60 bodies all pushing slightly forward gets transferred to the front the moment the front gives way. She positioned herself at the right edge of the gap and used her arms and her voice and her body to guide the lead animals right, away from the unstable drift, through the gap and into the open wind. They came through in a river of dark, steam-breathing bodies, and she stood in the gap and held them right and counted as they passed, and at 41 the drift to her left made the sound again, louder, and she was already moving right when it came down. Not catastrophically, not the whole drift, but a section of it the size of a wagon bed, heavy and sudden, hitting the space where she had been standing and pushing a cold, dense wave of snow outward that caught her knees and staggered her. She caught herself on the canyon wall. She held. The cattle kept coming. She got back to her position. 63 animals made it through the gap. 2 had bolted so far back into the canyon that Colton made the call to leave them. The gap wouldn't hold long enough to go back. And the decision cost him something visible in his face when he came through last, behind the herd, and saw her standing at the gap with the collapsed drift section beside her. He looked at the collapsed snow. He looked at her. She was shaking, she realized. Not from the cold alone, her body had been pumping something through her that was wearing off now, leaving her legs weak and her hands less steady than she wanted them to be. "The drift moved," he said. "I moved first." He looked at her for a moment. The wind was still screaming. The cattle were moving away from the canyon, Chalk keeping them in a rough group, and there was another 1.5 miles of ridge track between them and the ranch and no margin for standing still. "Can you walk?" Colton said. "Yes," she said, because the answer had to be yes, and because it was also true. They went. The walk back was worse than the walk out, because now they were managing 61 cattle on a ridge track in deteriorating conditions, the wind having found more of its strength in the hour they'd spent at the canyon. Twice cattle strayed toward the edge and had to be cut back. Once a section of the track turned out to be less solid than it looked, and the herd bunched and pushed and for 3 minutes it was simply a matter of holding position and shouting and hoping the physics worked out. And then it did, the animals finding their footing and moving forward. She focused on the animal directly in front of her and the rope at her wrist and keeping her feet under her. That was all. One foot, then the other. The cold was very deep now, past the point where she was registering it as pain, which she knew was not a good sign and which she filed in the part of her mind that was handling long-term concerns, while the immediate part handled not falling. They came off the ridge at noon, 3.5 hours after they'd gone up, and into the relative shelter of the lower ground, and she felt the wind ease by half, and her legs nearly buckled with the contrast. She didn't let them buckle. She kept walking. Denny was at the barn door, having seen them coming, and he got the barn open and helped push the cattle in, and he didn't say a word about any of it, which was exactly right. Inside the barn, out of the wind, the silence was enormous. She stood with her back against a stall post and breathed. Chalk had sat down on a hay bale. Colton was already checking the nearest cattle, running his hands down legs, checking for injury, his face doing the intense focus of a man accounting for things. Her feet were starting to hurt again, which was a better sign than not hurting. After a while, Colton straightened up from the cattle and looked at her. He had snow in his hair, and his face was raw from the wind, and there was something in his expression that hadn't been there when they'd left this morning. She wasn't sure she had the word for it yet. "You called the drift right," he said. "I was lucky," she said. "You were right," he said. He said it directly, without qualification. "And at the gap, the way you positioned, those 61 head are in this barn because of how you worked that gap." She was too cold and too tired to deflect it. "The cattle needed to be moved. We moved them." He was quiet for a moment. "You could have been badly hurt when the drift came down." "I moved in time." "Barely." She looked at him. "I'm aware." He held her gaze for a long moment. Outside, the blizzard was still working at the walls, but it had a different quality in here, something it had to work against instead of moving through freely. "Go inside and get warm," he said. "Take Fetch's extra socks from the bunkhouse. He has 2 pairs." She almost said she was fine. The word formed, and she looked at her hands and felt her feet and made a more honest assessment. "All right," she said. She walked to the bunkhouse. She found the socks. She went to the kitchen and built the fire as high as it would go and sat in the chair closest to it with the socks on and the quilt from the main room around her shoulders, and she sat there and shook for a while, which was the body's way of managing what the mind had been too busy to deal with. After a while, the shaking stopped, and what was left was a kind of hollow quietness and the deep, radiating warmth of the stove and the sound of the blizzard working at the outside of the house. She thought about the 2 cattle left in the canyon. She thought about Fetch, still somewhere in town, presumably sheltered. She thought about the drift coming down and the half-second of calculation that had put her 2 feet to the right before it moved. She thought about the look on Colton's face. She didn't know what to call it. It wasn't gratitude exactly. It was something older than that, something more fundamental. The look of a person who had believed one thing about you and had been shown another thing and was in the middle of revising. She pulled the quilt tighter. She listened to the storm. She had not proven anything to the people in Redstone Valley. Martha Greer was sitting in her warm boarding house right now with her sharp eyes and her loud opinions, and she had no idea what had happened on that ridge today, and probably wouldn't care if she did. But that wasn't, she realized, the point anymore. Maybe it hadn't been the point for a while. She looked around the kitchen, the organized shelves, the account books in their proper place, the preserved food stacked in the corner, the careful evidence of 3 weeks of work, and she felt something settle in her chest that was not pride exactly, but was related to it. The quieter version, the kind that didn't need an audience. The ranch was here. The cattle were in the barn. The fire was going. Outside, the storm did what storms did, which was everything it could, without consideration for anyone's plans or feelings, or the 2 people still caught in the middle of figuring out what they were to each other. It didn't matter. The walls were holding. The storm lasted 4 days, not continuously at full intensity. There were hours in the middle of the 2nd and 3rd days when the wind dropped to something merely brutal rather than catastrophic, and during those hours they moved, checked, repaired, calculated, and moved again. But the cold held without any negotiation, and the snow kept coming in waves, and by the morning of the 4th day the drifts against the north side of the barn were higher than the eave line, and the track to the road had ceased to exist as a concept. Fetch made it back on the second day, appearing out of the white at mid-morning like something conjured, half frozen, and deeply embarrassed, having sheltered at a family homestead 2 miles south when the storm hit Saturday night. He came in through the kitchen door, and Elara put coffee in his hands before he'd finished apologizing and told him to drink it before he tried to explain anything. He was 19 and he'd made a reasonable decision in a bad situation, and the self-flagellation was going to be more exhausting than useful. Ord's fever broke on the third day. He was weak and hollow-eyed but functional, and the relief in the bunkhouse was palpable. Not because they were sentimental about Ord exactly, but because losing a man in winter on a ranch this size had consequences that went beyond the personal. Elara managed the household through the storm with the focused efficiency of someone who had done the calculation in advance and was now executing the plan. The food stores she'd built up held. The firewood she'd insisted on restacking closer to the house in the week before the storm, a decision that had prompted a minor argument with Chalk, who felt the original position was adequate, turned out to be the difference between the kitchen staying warm and a very unpleasant middle-of-the-night hauling operation in blizzard conditions. She didn't mention this to Chalk. She didn't need to. What she hadn't planned for was the Hendersons. The Henderson family, not from Henderson's Mill, a different Henderson, farmed a section of land 2 miles northeast of the Ray Ranch, and on the morning of the third day, their eldest boy, a 14-year-old named Cal, came to the ranch door. He had walked 2 miles in the tail end of a blizzard, his coat inadequate for it, his face so cold he could barely speak when Elara opened the door and found him on the porch. She pulled him inside before he could explain anything. When he could talk, he said his father had gone through the ice on the East Pond trying to retrieve a sheep that had wandered and had been pulled out but had gone into a hard shaking that hadn't stopped. And his mother didn't know what to do, and there was no way to get to town for a doctor. Colton was at the barn. She sent Fetch to get him and sat Cal in front of the stove with a blanket and thought about what she knew about a body that had been in ice water and was shaking without stopping. She knew enough, not from formal training but from her years on her father's farm, where accidents happened and help was always at least an hour away, and you learned what you could manage yourself and what you couldn't. A man pulled from ice water who was shaking uncontrollably needed heat brought to the core, not to the extremities first, which was the instinct. Warm the chest, the abdomen, keep him awake, watch his breathing. Colton came in from the barn, and she told him in 30 seconds what Cal had said and what she thought needed doing. "I'll go," he said immediately. "You'll need supplies." She was already moving, the extra blankets from the chest in the hallway, the flat stones she'd been heating near the stove all winter for exactly this kind of cold weather use, wrapped in cloth, a flask of the strong broth she kept simmering on the back of the stove through the cold months. "Take Denny, he's steadier than Chalk in a crisis." "You're not coming?" He said it neutrally, but she heard the question underneath it. "Someone has to stay with the ranch. Ord isn't well enough and Fetch and Chalk aren't—" She paused. "Fetch and Chalk are fine for the cattle, but they're not good in a crisis." She handed him the bundle. "You know what to do with the heated stones, chest and abdomen, not hands and feet. Keep talking to him. If the shaking stops on its own and he warms up, good. If he stops responding when you talk to him, that's different." He took the bundle. He looked at her. "You've done this before." "My father's farmed when I was 16. He was fine." He nodded once. He and Denny went out into the last of the storm, with Cal between them, and Elara went back to the kitchen and kept the fire going and waited. They came back 4 hours later. Martin Henderson, the father, was with them, wrapped in 3 blankets and moving under his own power, which meant he'd turned the corner. His wife, Ruth, was behind him, having refused to stay behind once her husband was stable enough to move. She was a small, wiry woman in her 40s with the look of someone who hadn't slept in 2 days and had been frightened badly and was still managing it through the force of will that frontier women developed or didn't survive. She looked at Elara, really looked, the way people look when they're too exhausted for social calculation, and said, "You're the one who told Colton what to do." "Colton knew what to do," Elara said. "Cal said you had the stones ready, and the broth." Ruth Henderson looked around the kitchen, at the organized shelves and the fire and the simmering pot. "You prepared for something like this." "For the cold, generally." Ruth looked at her for another moment. "You're the mail-order bride from back east." "Elara Voss," she said. "Sit down. You look like you need to." Ruth Henderson sat down. And something in the way she did it, the surrender of it, the relief, made Elara understand that the woman had been holding herself together through will alone for going on 2 days and had just found a place where she could afford to let some of it go. She made Ruth Henderson tea and sat with her while Martin was settled near the stove, and Colton dealt with the logistical questions of where everyone would sleep, given that the storm wasn't finished with them yet. The Hendersons stayed 2 nights. By the time they left, with Martin recovered enough to walk steadily and the track to the road beaten down enough to be passable, something had shifted in the atmosphere of the ranch that was harder to define than the practical events that had caused it. Denny said nothing about any of it, but she caught him watching her with a different quality of attention, not the careful assessment of the first weeks, but something more settled, like a man who has been waiting to see what something was made of and has gotten his answer. Chalk, who had been the most consistently skeptical of her presence, helped her carry wood without being asked on the morning after the Hendersons left and didn't make a production of it in either direction. He just carried the wood. Fetch, who had always been eager to help, was now eager in a way that had more conviction behind it. The difference was small, but she noticed it. And Colton. Colton was harder to read than any of them, because he had always been careful about what he showed, and the storm had not fundamentally changed that. But there were moments, small ones, the kind you'd miss if you weren't paying attention, where something was different. He started asking her opinion about things before he'd reached his own conclusion, rather than after, which was a different kind of asking. He told her one evening about the water rights situation on the eastern boundary that he'd been managing alone for 2 years, just told her, without preamble, as if it were something she should know. She understood it was a form of trust, offered quietly because quiet was the only way he knew how to offer things. She didn't make more of it than it was, but she didn't make less of it either. The aftermath of the blizzard brought Redstone Valley to the Ray Ranch, which was not something Elara had anticipated. It started with the Hendersons, who talked about what had happened. Not dramatically, not as a story, but the way people talk about things in small communities, informatively, the way news travels because everyone is affected by weather and livestock and survival, and the question of who helped and who didn't matters in ways that go beyond sentiment. Martin Henderson mentioned the stones and the broth and the instructions. Ruth Henderson mentioned that she'd been afraid and had found something solid to lean on. Within a week, 3 families had come to the ranch. Not in a delegation, not formally. One at a time, with practical pretexts. A question about feed prices. A report about a section of boundary fence they'd found down in the storm. Information about a family further north who had lost cattle in a canyon and were looking for any animals that might have drifted south. Real reasons? All of them, but with something underneath the real reasons that was more about forming an opinion than exchanging information. Elara served coffee and talked practically and watched how Colton handled it, which was, well, she thought. He was a man who was better with people than he seemed at first, who had built something like a reputation in this territory before the hard years had turned him inward. She could see it in how the neighboring ranchers talked to him, not as a man they were assessing, but as someone they had a relationship with that had gone dormant and was reactivating. She stayed in the background during most of these conversations. This was deliberate. She was learning the territory, learning the people, and she had a clear-eyed understanding that her influence here was most effective when it was least visible. She had no history in this valley, no established credibility. What she had was Colton's trust, which was growing, and the practical evidence of the last weeks, which was growing too. The third visitor, a rancher named August Pell, changed the shape of things. Pell ran the largest independent ranch south of the valley, about 800 acres of decent grazing land. He was in his 60s, compact, with the unhurried manner of a man who had learned that patience was a more efficient tool than speed. He arrived on a Thursday afternoon, sat down with Colton over coffee, and after 20 minutes of general conversation about the storm and the road conditions and the state of the cattle market, he said, without particular emphasis, "I heard you sent your 60-day notice to Aldrich." Colton said yes, he had. Pell nodded slowly. "I've been thinking about doing the same for 2 years," he said. "Couldn't work out the numbers well enough to feel comfortable with it." There was a pause. Colton looked at Elara. It was a brief look, the kind you'd miss, but she understood it. "Elara worked out the numbers on our situation," Colton said. "If you wanted to talk through the calculation, she could walk you through how we approached it." Pell looked at her. His look was not dismissive. It was the considering look of a man gathering information. "You're the one who wrote to Henderson's mill." "I sent an inquiry," she said. "The terms were favorable." "Henderson's can't deliver to me at all," he said. "Too far south for their route." "There's a mill operation near Junction Flat," she said. "Carvey Brothers. I haven't written to them, but the distance works for your location." He looked at her for a moment. "How do you know about Carvey Brothers?" "Ruth Henderson mentioned them. Her cousin worked there a few years back." She kept her voice practical. "I don't know their pricing, but it's worth an inquiry." He thought about it. Then he said to Colton, more than to her, "That's a useful woman you found." Colton looked at her. She met his eyes briefly before looking back at her coffee. "Yes," he said. "She is." After Pell left, Colton sat at the kitchen table for a while without speaking. She gave him the quiet, because she'd noticed that he processed things in silence, and interrupting it before he was ready cost more than it gained. Eventually he said, "Pell has the most acreage of any independent rancher in this part of the valley." "I know," she said. "If he starts talking to other ranchers about the supply arrangement, about Aldrich's pricing structure, it stops being one rancher's complaint," she said. "It becomes information shared between neighbors." He looked at her. "Is that what you're thinking?" She considered the question carefully. "I'm thinking that Aldrich built his position over a long time by operating individually with each rancher. Each rancher thinks they have a private arrangement. If they ever compared notes, they'd see the pattern." She paused. "I'm not suggesting anything in particular. I'm just observing that information shared between neighbors has a different weight than information held alone." He was quiet for a moment. "You're careful," he said. "I try to be." "Why?" She looked at him. "Because I'm still new here, and because the things that could go wrong if I move too fast are worse than the things that could go right." He nodded slowly. "What about Aldrich himself? When he finds out Pell is looking at alternative suppliers, he'll push," she said. "He'll push on whoever he thinks is the weak point." She met Colton's eyes. "That's probably still us. We're the ones who started it." Aldrich came back on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the blizzard, and this time he didn't bother with coffee. He came into the yard in the afternoon when Colton was visible near the barn, which she thought was calculated, visible enough to confront, out in the open where a scene could be witnessed. She was at the kitchen window, and she watched it begin the way she'd watched the previous confrontation, reading it in the body language in the distance. But this time it didn't stay in the yard. Aldrich raised his voice. She couldn't hear the words, but she could hear the tone. Sharp, carrying, the voice of a man making a performance of his displeasure for the benefit of anyone within range. Chalk and Fetch were near the fence line, and she saw them stop working. Denny, coming from the direction of the north pasture, also stopped. Colton's response was inaudible from where she stood. He was not shouting. He was doing the still, upright thing, which under the circumstances was the right response, and also, she suspected, what was making Aldrich angrier. Then Aldrich said something that made Colton's posture change. A slight shift, the shoulders coming forward, and Elara put down the cloth she was holding and went outside. She crossed the yard at a normal pace. Not running. Running would have looked like panic. When she reached them, Aldrich was in the middle of saying something about the credit agreement, his voice still elevated, his face dark with it. He saw her coming and stopped mid-sentence. "Miss Voss?" he said. The name was not a greeting. "Mr. Aldrich," she said. There was a beat of quiet. She positioned herself beside Colton, not in front of him, beside him, which was a different statement. "This is a business conversation between ranchers," Aldrich said. "I don't think it requires—" "The credit agreement was negotiated under false pretenses," she said. The sentence landed in the air between them. Aldrich's face did something complicated. Surprise first, then a recalibration very similar to what Colton's face had done in the early weeks, but harder and less honest. "That's a significant accusation," he said carefully. "It's an observation," she said. The 5-year exclusivity clause was not verbally disclosed when the arrangement was presented to Mr. Ray. It was embedded in the 4th paragraph of a document presented as a standard credit agreement. She kept her voice even. "Mr. Ray has honored the terms of that agreement, including the 60-day notice requirement, which he has provided in writing. The arrangement is concluding legally and properly. The terms are being honored," she said. "If you believe otherwise, you're welcome to take the matter to a lawyer. The written notice is dated and witnessed." She paused. I would also note that Mr. Pell and at least 2 other ranchers in this area have begun reviewing their own supply arrangements and finding some similar structures they weren't aware of. She had not planned to say the last sentence. It came out of a calculation that happened faster than deliberation. Aldrich was the kind of man who backed down from a threat and not from a principle, and the most available threat was the one that was actually true. Aldrich looked at her for a long moment. His expression had gone through several stages and had landed somewhere flat and controlled. "You've been busy," he said quietly. "I've been organized," she said. Another long pause. Then Aldrich looked at Colton, past her, deliberately past her, which was its own message. "This isn't finished," he said. "Our business arrangement is finishing exactly as the agreement allows," Colton said. His voice was steady. "If you have a legal concern, a lawyer is the right place for it." Aldrich turned. He walked back to his wagon. He climbed up without looking back. The wagon went down the track and turned toward the road and was gone. In the silence that followed, she heard Denny from somewhere behind her say, very quietly, to no one in particular, "Well." She became aware that Colton was looking at her with an expression she still didn't entirely have the vocabulary for, and also that her hands, at her sides where no one could see them, were not entirely steady. "The Pell part," Colton said quietly, so only she could hear. "Was that accurate?" "Pell is reviewing his arrangement," she said. "I didn't say how far along he was." He looked at her for a moment. Then something moved in his face that was not a smile, not quite, but related to one. "Come inside," he said. "You're cold." She was, she realized. She'd come out without her coat. The legal question turned out to be real. 10 days later, a letter arrived from a lawyer in the county seat representing Jonas Aldrich, arguing that the credit arrangement had been violated by the inquiry to Henderson's Mill even before the 60-day notice had been issued, and demanding payment of the full outstanding balance plus a penalty sum that appeared to have been arrived at by multiplying the outstanding balance by whatever number Aldrich had decided he wanted. Elara read the letter twice. Then she sat down with the credit agreement document and went through it paragraph by paragraph for the 3rd time since she'd first read it. The inquiry to Henderson's Mill had been a private letter. It had resulted in no purchase. The agreement specified primary supplier changes required notice. It said nothing about inquiries. The penalty clause cited in the lawyer's letter referenced a section of the agreement that, when she actually read that section, said nothing of the kind it was being cited to support. She wrote a response that evening. She wrote it carefully. In the formal register she'd learned from years of watching her father deal with seed merchants and county assessors and the various men who tried to use paperwork as a substitute for right. She addressed each claim. She quoted the relevant language of the agreement. She noted the discrepancy between the penalty clause cited and what the relevant section actually said. She showed it to Colton. He read it. He read it again. He set it down. "You should have been a lawyer," he said. "My father needed a farmhand, not a lawyer," she said. "But some of the skills overlap." She tapped the letter. "This should go back within the week. The faster you respond, the clearer it becomes that you're not afraid of the scrutiny." He looked at the letter for a moment. "Is this going to work?" "I don't know," she said honestly. If Aldrich actually wants to litigate, a lawyer who read the document carefully would have a hard time making his case. But lawyers can be expensive even when you're right. "And if it doesn't work?" She met his eyes. "Then we deal with what comes next. But I don't think it gets to litigation. I think he's testing whether you'll fold." Colton looked at the letter for a long moment. "He's been testing that for 3 years," he said. It came out with a quiet bitterness that was clearly old, not freshly made. "You haven't folded," she said. He looked up. "The ranch is still here," she said. "He's been at it for 3 years and you're still here. That's not nothing." He was quiet. She let it sit. "Send the letter," he said. The letter went. The response from Aldrich's lawyer came back after 2 weeks, shorter, with the penalty demand reduced significantly and the main claim reframed in terms that suggested a settlement offer rather than litigation. She read it and felt something like satisfaction, but tempered it immediately because satisfaction had a way of making you stop paying attention, and she had learned that the moment you stopped paying attention was precisely when things moved. She wrote back again. 2 more exchanges followed over the next month. By the end of them, the outstanding balance was agreed upon at the original amount without penalties, to be paid in the spring from the proceeds of the sales season, which was what Colton had planned from the beginning, before Aldrich had decided to make it a confrontation. It was not a dramatic resolution. There was no scene of triumph, no moment of public reckoning. There was just a letter, and then another letter, and then a mutual understanding that a business relationship was ending on terms that were, within the narrow technical definition of the word, fair. Colton came into the kitchen with the final letter and set it on the table in front of her. "It's done," he said. She read it. She nodded. "It's done." He sat down across from her, which he did more often now. Sat down and stayed, rather than the in-and-out quality of those early weeks. "He'll go after Pell next," he said, "or one of the others." "Maybe, but Pell knows to look at the fourth paragraph of anything Aldrich gives him now." She paused. "And the ones who heard about the supply arrangement comparison, they know what to look for too." He was quiet for a moment. "You know they're going to say you orchestrated this." She looked at him. "Who is they?" "People in town." "Aldrich, definitely." "Martha Greer." He said the name without inflection. But she understood he knew about the scene on the street, had probably always known. "They're going to say a woman who'd been here 2 months couldn't have just done this by accident." "It wasn't by accident," she said. "I saw a problem, and I worked on it." "That's what they'll say you orchestrated. Let them." She kept her voice level. "I didn't do anything improper. I wrote letters and read documents and had conversations. If that's orchestration, I'll take the word." He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, the winter light was coming through the kitchen window at the flat, colorless angle of February, and it caught the side of his face in a way that made him look different than she'd seen him before. Not softer, exactly, but less armored. "I should have seen Aldrich for what he was earlier," he said. "You were managing a lot alone," she said. "That's an excuse." "It's a reason," she said. "Reasons aren't excuses. You were stretched and you trusted someone who'd learned how to appear trustworthy, and you were dealing with hard years. That's not a character flaw. That's a hard situation." He looked at the table. "My first wife saw it," he said quietly. "She said something about him, near the end. I didn't—" He stopped. "I didn't want to hear it." She didn't say anything. This was not something she was going to push on. After a moment, he looked up. "She was sick," he said. "The second winter. It went fast, faster than anyone expected." He said it the way he said hard things, flat, direct, because circling them cost more than going through them. She would have liked you, I think." The sentence sat between them. It was the most personal thing he had said to her in 2 months, and she understood the weight of it, not as a romantic statement, but as something rarer from a man like him. An honest comparison between a woman he had lost and a woman he was still figuring out, offered without apology or performance. She thought carefully about how to receive it. "I think she did good work here," Elara said finally. "The account system she set up, the bones of it, were sound. I just built on them." He looked at her for a moment. Something in his face settled, the way a thing settles when it's been held tense for too long, and finally finds a resting position. "Yes," he said. She did. They sat for a moment in the winter kitchen with the flat February light and the sound of the ranch outside and the letter on the table between them, which represented the end of one thing and the unclear beginning of several others. "The North Watercourse," she said eventually, because it was easier to move toward the practical than to sit too long in the other thing. "Denny said spring will be early this year. If it is, the silt clearing needs to happen fast before the ground softens too much to work." He came back from wherever he'd been, nodded. "I've been thinking about that. We'd need to hire in. We don't have enough hands for the cattle work and the watercourse at the same time." "Pell mentioned his men were short of work in early spring," she said, "before the grazing season starts." "You think he'd share workers?" "I think if you asked him as a neighbor rather than as a business arrangement, he would." She paused. "He's a man who responds to being treated like an equal." Colton thought about it. "I'll ride out to see him next week." "Don't write," she said. "Go in person." He looked at her. "Why?" "Because a letter is a transaction. Writing out is a different kind of thing." She met his eyes. "You're building something different with the ranchers around here than what Aldrich had with you. That takes face-to-face." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You're right." She looked at the letter on the table one more time. 2 months and 3 weeks since she had stepped off the stage in Redstone Valley with $47 in her coat and a town full of laughter behind her. The ranch was different than it had been. The finances were clear and the course was better. The north section was still theirs, the watercourse problem still solvable, and the man across the table from her was not the same man who had looked at her on the porch with that first, careful, recalibrating expression. Neither, she thought, was she the same woman. She was harder in some ways. The blizzard had done something to her sense of what she was capable of, not made her arrogant about it, but settled it. The shaking afterward, alone in the kitchen with the quilt, she didn't regret that either. It was honest. You did the thing, and then you let yourself feel what it cost, and then you got up. She was softer in other ways she hadn't expected. The kitchen in the morning with the light coming in, the sound of the ranch waking up, Fetch's guileless enthusiasm, Denny's weathered, careful intelligence, the 2 cattle they'd lost in the canyon, which still sat in a corner of her mind in a way she hadn't expected losses to sit. And Colton across the table with his difficult silences and his careful offering of difficult things, and his hands that were scarred from 38 years of doing the work rather than directing it. She picked up the letter and folded it and put it in the account box where the important documents were kept. "I'll start on the spring supply order," she said. "Henderson's delivery window is April. We need the order in by mid-March." "All right," he said. She got up and got the account book and the paper and sat back down, and he stayed at the table, and after a while he got the fence survey he'd been working on from the other room and spread it on the table, and they worked in the same space in the winter quiet, each on their own task. And outside the February light shifted toward afternoon, and the ranch moved through its daily business, and the north section sat on the other side of the ridge waiting for spring. It was ordinary in the way that good things sometimes manage to be. Not dramatic, not resolved into something neat, but real in the specific, unglamorous, durable way that only ordinary things manage to be real. She turned a page in the account book and kept working. The Hendersons' order went in on the 12th of March, 4 days ahead of the deadline she'd set herself, which was 2 days ahead of the deadline she'd told Colton about, because she had learned that building margins into every timeline was the difference between managing a situation and being managed by it. Spring in this territory did not arrive the way spring arrived in Pennsylvania. It did not soften in gradually, coaxing the ground back to life with a few warm afternoons and some tentative green. It came in arguments. 3 days of warmth that made you believe it, then a hard freeze that killed whatever had started to trust the warmth, then warmth again, then wind, then rain that was almost sleet. Then one morning you woke up and the mud was real mud and the grass was coming and the mountains still had snow on them, but the lower ground was moving again. It was not gentle. It was the kind of spring that required something from you. Elara met it in the yard on a Tuesday in late March, watching the first real light of the season come over the eastern ridge, and felt the ground give slightly under her boots in a way it hadn't for 4 months, and thought about everything that needed doing in the next 6 weeks, and started organizing it in her mind the way she always organized things, by dependency, by timing, by what failure in each item would cost. The North Watercourse was first. Colton had ridden out to see August Pell in February, as she'd suggested, and had come back 3 hours later with an agreement that 2 of Pell's hands would come over for a week in early April, when their own operation was between winter and grazing season. He hadn't said much about how the conversation had gone, but she'd noticed that when he mentioned Pell afterward, it was with a different quality than before. Not the careful, assessing way he mentioned most people, but with something more like ease. She hadn't pushed him on it. She was learning the particular patience of building trust in a man who had learned to extend it slowly and not without cost. The 2 Pell hands arrived on a Monday, brothers named Walt and C, short for something nobody had bothered to explain, who were competent and quiet and ate a quantity of food that required Elara to revise her supply estimates upward after the first day. She revised them without comment and made more biscuits and absorbed this as data for future planning. The watercourse work was harder than Denny's spring estimate had suggested. The silt had compacted over 2.5 winters into something closer to clay than ordinary sediment, and the redirection work Denny had done in November had, while preventing further backup, also allowed a secondary blockage to develop 20 yards upstream that nobody had seen from the surface. They found it on the second day when Walt dug down expecting silt and hit a mass of packed debris, branches, root material, river stone, that was acting as a dam. Colton looked at it for a long time when they showed him. She stood beside him and looked at it too. "How long has that been there, he said, more to himself than anyone. "At least 2 seasons, Denny said. "Maybe 3. It's solid." Aldrich knew about the silt problem, Elara said quietly. Only Colton could hear her. If he had anyone look at this section. He'd have known the silt wasn't the real problem, Colton said. His voice had gone flat. "Yes." He stood there for another moment, then, "How long to clear it?" Walt and C exchanged a look. 2 days if the ground cooperates, Walt said. 3 if it doesn't. "Clear it," Colton said. It took 2.5 days. The ground cooperated approximately half the time, which was about as much as anyone had a right to expect from ground that had been frozen for 4 months. By Thursday afternoon, the secondary blockage was cleared, the main channel was running clean, and the watercourse was doing what it was supposed to do for what was, by Denny's estimation, the first time in close to 3 years. Colton stood at the edge of the running water and watched it for a while. She watched him watching it. There was something in his face that she had no name for. Not triumph, because it was too quiet for triumph, and not grief, though there was some of that in the lines around his eyes. It was more like the expression of a man who has been walking a long distance in bad conditions and has stopped for a moment and allowed himself to register how far he has come. He didn't say anything. She didn't say anything either. They stood there and let the water run. April moved toward May with the busy, unapologetic urgency of a season that has lost 2 months to winter and intends to recover them. The kitchen garden went in, not just the basics she'd found evidence of in previous years, but an expanded plan she'd been sketching on paper through February and March, informed by the soil analysis she'd done in the fall and the drainage patterns she'd been observing all winter. More root vegetables than had been grown here before, because root vegetables stored well and provided through the winter months. A larger herb section because she was tired of cooking without them. A section of ground prepared for next year's grain crop that wasn't large enough to replace the Hendersons' order but would reduce their dependence on it. She recruited Fetch for the garden work, which he accepted with his characteristic eager goodwill, and discovered that Fetch, despite his youth and his social awkwardness, had genuine instincts about growing things. An eye for spacing, a feel for when soil was ready, the kind of unhurried attentiveness that plants required. She told him so, because she believed in telling people when they were good at something, and the way his face changed when she said it was evidence of how rarely anyone had. "My mother gardened," he said, as if this explained everything. "She taught you well," Elara said. He was quiet for a moment, pushing soil around a seedling with the care of someone handling something fragile. "She died when I was 11, he said. She kept working beside him. "Then you carried it yourself," she said. "What she gave you." He thought about that. "I never thought about it that way." "Most people don't," she said. "But that's what happens. The people who teach us things, they go on inside us whether they're here or not." He nodded slowly, and they kept working. These were the small moments she had not expected. Not the account books, and the legal letters, and the blizzard, but the quieter things. The conversations at the kitchen table that happened because she was there and had become a fixed point that people oriented toward. The way Ord, recovered from his fever, had started telling her things about the cattle operation that she hadn't asked about, but that she received carefully and used well, so that he kept telling her more. The way Denny had begun, in his laconic, indirect way, to treat her opinions as worth factoring into his own planning, which from Denny was equivalent to a formal endorsement. She had not come here to be liked. She had been clear about that with herself from the beginning. But being trusted was different from being liked, and she had not fully anticipated how much of what she was building here was made of exactly that. The trouble with Jonas Aldrich did not end with the final legal letter. She had expected it might not. Aldrich was a man who had built his position over a long time and who understood that positions required maintenance, and she had taken away a significant piece of his, not just the Ray Ranch supply contract, but the broader influence that came from being the man other men depended on. August Pell had quietly moved his feed arrangement to a supplier in the county south, and 2 other ranchers had let their Aldrich arrangements lapse without renewal. The financial impact to Aldrich was probably not devastating, but the loss of a certain kind of standing in this territory was something men like Aldrich felt in a particular, lasting way. What he did with that feeling was to talk. She heard about it first from Ruth Henderson, who came to the ranch on a Saturday in May on the pretext of returning a pot she'd borrowed in February during the blizzard crisis. A pot Elara had genuinely forgotten about and had not been expecting back, which made her like Ruth Henderson more than she already did. Ruth came in, set the pot on the table, accepted coffee, and then said, in the matter-of-fact way of someone delivering information she thought the other person deserved to have, "Aldrich has been telling people in town that you manipulated Colton into breaking a legal business agreement and that he's planning to consult a lawyer about filing a proper claim." Elara looked at her coffee cup. "Has he said anything specific about the legal claim?" "No, I think it's mostly talk." Ruth paused. "But Martha Greer has picked it up, and Martha Greer's talk spreads." Of course it did. Martha Greer, who had laughed on the main street of Redstone Valley the afternoon Elara had stepped off the stage, had apparently found in Aldrich's grievance a vehicle for a more sustained form of the same opinion she'd formed in 30 seconds. That Elara Voss was a problem, an interloper, a woman operating outside the boundaries of what a mail-order bride from back east was supposed to be. "What's she saying?" Elara said. Ruth looked at her with the direct, assessing gaze of a woman who had survived enough difficulty that she'd stopped softening things unnecessarily. "That you've been running the Ray Ranch like you own it. That Colton doesn't know what he's gotten himself into. That a man like Jonas Aldrich wouldn't be in the position he's in unless someone had worked against him improperly." She paused. "That you've made Colton dependent on you so you could take advantage." Elara sat with this for a moment. She had known something like this was possible. She had known from the first afternoon that Martha Greer had filed her away in a category and would not revise that filing unless compelled to. What she hadn't fully accounted for was how much the compulsion would need to be public. Not private, not legal, not made in letters and account books, but in front of people, in the arena where Martha Greer operated. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "I thought you should know." Ruth looked at her steadily. "My husband and I. Martin thinks Aldrich is a man with a grudge trying to make it look like a principal. And I think—" She stopped. She looked at the pot she'd brought back, and then at the kitchen, at the organized shelves and the garden visible through the window, and the account books on their proper shelf. "I think what I saw the night of the blizzard, you had things ready that you couldn't have had ready unless you'd been thinking ahead. Nobody thinks ahead like that for their own benefit." "I was thinking about the ranch," Elara said. "I know," Ruth said. "That's the point." After Ruth left, Elara sat alone in the kitchen for a while. She did what she always did when a problem was too large to hold still. She broke it into its components. The legal threat was not real. The final letter had made that clear, and Aldrich's own lawyer had backed down from it. The talk was real, but talk's power depended on whether it circulated in a vacuum or whether there was countervailing information in the same space. She thought about what information existed. And then she thought about who held it and whether they would use it. She was still thinking about this when Colton came in from the north pasture. She told him what Ruth had said. She told him plainly, the way she'd learned he needed things told, without softening, but also without alarm, because alarm in him produced a kind of bracing stillness that wasn't useful. He listened. His face went through the closed, controlled process of receiving something he didn't like. When she finished, he said, "He doesn't have a legal claim. We both know that." "Yes," she said. "But the talk—" "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "Martha Greer has been talking about you since the day you arrived." "I know that too." He looked at her. "Does it bother you?" She considered the honest answer. "It used to bother me more than it does now. It still bothers me, but less because of what she thinks and more because of what she can do with it. There are people in this valley who are still making up their minds about this ranch and about—" She paused. "About us. And if the only story they hear comes from Aldrich and Martha Greer, that's a problem." He was quiet for a longer time. She let him be quiet. "There's a community meeting," he said finally, "first Saturday of June. We used to go, before the hard years. I stopped going." He said it without elaborating, but she understood. The hard years had turned him inward, and community meetings required a version of yourself that was outward-facing, and that had been too much to manage when everything else was also too much. "Would you go this year?" she said. "If you came with me." She looked at him. He was looking at the table in the way he looked at things he found difficult to say, Not avoiding her eyes exactly, but finding it easier to say the difficult thing to a neutral surface. "Yes," she said, "I'll come." The community meeting was held in the larger of Redstone Valley's two public buildings, a hall that served as meeting space, an occasional courthouse, and whatever else the community needed it to be on a given day. By the time Colton and Elara arrived, there were already 40 or 50 people inside, which was a significant portion of the ranching community in this part of the territory. She had not been to Redstone Valley since the day she'd arrived. She had not deliberately avoided it. There simply hadn't been a reason to go, and the ranch had given her enough to do. But now, walking through the door of that hall with Colton beside her, she was aware of the way attention moved in a room, the particular shift of it when something unexpected enters. She had dressed carefully. Not elaborately. She had nothing elaborate, and elaborate would have been the wrong choice anyway. She wore her better dress, which was dark blue and well-made if not fashionable, and she had put her hair up properly, and she carried herself the way she always carried herself, which was upright and unhurried, because she had learned at a young age that how you moved through a room told people things before you said a word. She saw Martha Greer immediately. Martha Greer saw her. She did not look away. She met Martha's gaze for a moment and then moved her attention elsewhere with the calm of someone who has more important things to look at. August Pell was there near the back, and he nodded at her with the particular small nod that meant something in this community. A recognition that was also a positioning, a signal to anyone watching about where he stood. Martin Henderson, looking healthy and solid, in the way of men who have come back from something frightening and been given their full strength back, caught her eye and raised a hand. Ruth was beside him, and Ruth smiled at her with the directness that Elara had come to appreciate. She and Colton found seats near the center of the room. The meeting covered the practical business of a ranching community in spring, road maintenance, boundary disputes, a proposal for a shared water monitoring system on the eastern creek that ran through several properties. Colton spoke twice, briefly, on practical matters, and she noticed the way people listened to him, with the attention given to someone whose opinion they were accustomed to trusting and had not heard in a while. It was toward the end of the meeting, during the open comment period, that Jonas Aldrich spoke. He stood up in the way he did everything, with the practiced ease of a man performing confidence. He said he had a concern to raise about business practices in the community. He said he believed in open dealing between neighbors. He said that the sanctity of written agreements was the foundation of commerce in this territory, and that when agreements were manipulated by parties operating outside the established customs of the ranching community, it affected everyone. He did not say Elara's name. He did not say Colton's name. He didn't need to. The room was quiet. She felt the attention shift, the way a herd shifts when it senses something. She kept her hands in her lap. She kept her face neutral. She breathed. Then August Pell stood up. "I'll say something on this," Pell said, in the unhurried way of a man who had decided what he thought and had no reason to perform uncertainty. "I looked at my supply arrangement with Jonas this winter. Really looked at it. I found a 5-year exclusivity clause in the 4th paragraph of a document presented to me as a standard credit agreement." He paused. "I didn't know it was there. I expect some of you might want to look at your own arrangements and see what's in the 4th paragraph." The silence in the room had a different quality now. Martin Henderson stood up. He did not have Pell's ranching stature in the community, but he had something else. The credibility of a man who nearly died in a blizzard and was standing in front of everyone, visibly alive. He said he wanted to speak to what he'd seen at the Ray Ranch during the blizzard, the preparations that had been in place, the response when Cal came to the door, the way things had been handled. He didn't editorialize much. He said what happened in the way men in this territory said things, factually, without decoration, with the implicit understanding that facts were the form of honesty they trusted most. When he sat down, there was a murmur in the room that was not hostile to the Ray Ranch. Aldrich tried to respond. He said something about newcomers who didn't understand the customs of the territory. He said something about the importance of experience over cleverness. He said it with the smile, but the smile had lost some of its surface, and what was showing underneath was something smaller and harder and less pleasant. Martha Greer, Elara noticed, was quiet. She had the look of someone recalibrating, which was not the look of someone who had changed her mind. Martha Greer was not built for rapid conversions, but the look of someone who had noticed that the room was not arranged in the way she'd expected it to be arranged. The meeting concluded without resolution of any particular conflict, which was how these things worked. Nothing was settled in a room like this. It just got aired, and what mattered was the quality of the air afterward. People moved toward the door, and some of them stopped near her and Colton on the way out and said things. Some of them small, some of them less small. A woman she hadn't met before, who introduced herself as Clara Briggs, said she'd heard about the watercourse clearing and that her husband had a similar problem on their eastern boundary, and could she talk to someone about the approach? Elara said yes, come out any time. The last person was a man she'd also not met, elderly, with the weathered patience of someone who had seen this territory in all its iterations. He looked at her for a moment and said, "You wrote the letter that got Aldrich's lawyer to back down." She said the situation had resolved legally. He nodded. "I know what that means," he said, "and I know what it takes." He looked at her with the evaluating eyes of someone who had spent a long time forming opinions and was satisfied with this one. "This valley needs more people who read the fourth paragraph," he said, and walked out. She stood there for a moment. Then she went to find Colton. They drove back to the ranch in the late afternoon light, the horses moving at the unhurried pace of animals that know the road home, the spring air carrying the smell of wet earth and new grass, and something that was almost warmth. For a while, neither of them said anything. The road had its familiar sounds, wheels on the track, the horses breathing, the distant ongoing conversation of the land settling into its spring configuration. "Pell didn't have to do that," Colton said finally. "No," she said. "He did it because it was true," he said. "Not because we asked him." "Yes." Another stretch of quiet. The ranch was visible in the distance now, the barn catching the last of the afternoon light. "Martha Greer will still think what she thinks," Colton said. "Probably," Elara said. "Some people decide what you are, and they keep the decision regardless of evidence. You can't reach them, and it's not useful to try." She looked at the road. "But some people are still making up their minds. Those are the ones worth showing something real." He was quiet for a while. Then, "What Pell said, about the fourth paragraph." He glanced at her. "You told him to look." "I mentioned that our situation had involved an overlooked clause," she said. "I didn't tell him what to do about it." "But you told him in a way that he knew to look." She looked at him steadily. "Yes." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked back at the road. "I'm glad you did," he said. It was a small sentence. She understood it was not a small thing. The ranch came up to meet them, the way familiar things do. Not dramatically, but with the particular solidity of something that has become known. She looked at the kitchen garden visible from the track, the rows coming in green and orderly against the dark earth. She looked at the barn with its repaired fence and the east pasture beyond it, running properly all the way to the ridge. She looked at the house with the porch where she had first stood and looked at this man, and he had looked at her, and neither of them had known what to make of the other. On an evening in June, several weeks after the community meeting, she was at the kitchen table with the account books, a quarterly review she'd instituted that gave her a running picture of where the ranch stood, when Colton came in from the evening check and didn't go back out, which was unusual. He washed up, and he sat down across from her, and he had the look of a man who has been working up to something for a while and has decided tonight is when it happens. She set down her pen. He said, "I've been thinking about the arrangement." She waited. "The way we set it up," he said. "The mail order situation, what I wrote in the letter." He was looking at the table. "I wrote that I needed a wife of practical disposition, that it was a partnership of function." "I remember the letter," she said. "I've been thinking that it's not the whole of what this is now." He looked up. "Or what I'd want it to be." She held very still. "I'm not good at this," he said. "I want to say that before I say the rest. I wasn't, with my first wife, and the years alone haven't made me better at it." He looked at her with the directness that was one of the things she had come to understand was his particular form of honesty. Not comfortable, but real. "But I'd like it to be more than a partnership of function, if you'd want that." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, something moved in the garden. A bird, probably, settling in the new leaves. She had been thinking about this too, in the careful, peripheral way she thought about things she wasn't ready to address directly. She had been honest with herself that what she'd felt in the early weeks The calculation, the pragmatism, the clear-eyed assessment of terms had shifted as the weeks became months. She had not planned for it to shift. Planning was not the mechanism by which it had happened. "I'm not easy to be with," she said. "I need to say that too. I see things, and I say them, and sometimes I'm right, and sometimes I'm too sure I'm right when I'm not. I move fast on problems, and sometimes that's useful, and sometimes it's not." She held his eyes. "I'm not the woman people were picturing when they thought of a frontier wife." "No," he said, "you're not." Something in the way he said it made her understand that he meant this as a statement of fact and not as criticism. That he had arrived at something on the other side of his own expectations and found it better than what he'd expected. "I'd want that," she said. He nodded. He didn't move across the table or reach for her hand or do anything dramatic, which was right, because dramatic gestures were not the language either of them spoke fluently. He just nodded, and something in his face settled in the way it settled when a thing that had been uncertain became certain, and then he reached across and picked up the fence survey he'd left on the table 2 evenings ago and said, "The South Pasture section. I want to get your read on the rotation plan before I finalize it." She picked up her pen. "Show me." And they worked. The evening came in through the kitchen window, soft and long, the way June evenings were in this territory, and the account book sat beside the fence survey, and the lamp was warm, and outside the kitchen garden was growing in the dark, and the north watercourse ran clean and clear down from the ridge, and the ranch was different than it had been when a stage had pulled into Redstone Valley on a Thursday afternoon and deposited a woman with a trunk and $47 sewn into her coat hem onto a street full of people who had already decided what she was. Not all of it resolved cleanly. That is the honest thing to say, the thing that needs to be said, because the alternative is a story that doesn't tell the truth about what it costs to build something real. Martha Greer did not change her opinion. She softened, eventually, into a kind of watchful silence that was not friendship, but was at least the absence of active hostility, and Elara accepted this as approximately what was available and spent no further energy on it. Aldrich did not file a legal claim. He withdrew from the Northern Territory's social life gradually, the way men do when the community has formed an opinion that is not favorable, spending more time in the county south where his reputation hadn't been aired. He did not disappear. Men like Aldrich don't disappear. But he became less present, and his particular form of patient, systematic pressure became less effective when people were reading the 4th paragraph. Colton had hard months, the kind that come to any farming operation regardless of how well managed it is, because weather and animal disease and the unpredictable plain bad luck of working the land don't care about your account books or your fence surveys. A section of the North herd got into bad water in late summer, and they lost 11 head, which cost them in money and in the particular way that losing animals costs people who work closely with them. Colton went quiet for several days afterward in the way he went quiet under grief, and she didn't push him out of it, but she sat with him in the evenings and let the quiet be shared rather than solitary, which is a different thing entirely. She made mistakes too. She moved too fast on a proposal to expand the cattle operation in the 2nd year, laid out the numbers and the logic, and pushed harder than the situation warranted because she was right about the numbers but wrong about the timing, and Colton told her so with more sharpness than he usually allowed himself. And she was short with him in return, and they had a real argument, the kind with actual heat in it, that left them both sitting in separate rooms for an evening before one of them, she didn't remember which, later, came back into the kitchen and said something practical about supper that was also an opening, and the argument resolved the way honest arguments between people of goodwill resolve. Incompletely, with some things left unsaid, but with the understanding that the relationship was larger than the disagreement and would hold it. She had not known, coming here, whether that was possible with a man like Colton. She had hoped for something functional. She had found something more durable than that and less tidy than she might have wished, which was, she'd come to understand, what real things felt like. Fetch stayed on the ranch. He turned 20 and then 21 and developed into a genuinely skilled hand, with his gardening instincts expanding into a broader practical intelligence about growing and land that Elara encouraged without directing. She wrote a letter on his behalf when he expressed interest in learning more about soil management from an agricultural college 2 territories south, and when the letter came back with an acceptance, she told him to go. He was surprised she meant it. She meant it completely. "You'll come back better," she said. What if I find something else? He said, with the honesty of youth. Then you'll have found something else, she said. That's not a loss. He left in September of the second year and wrote 3 letters that first winter, which told her everything she needed to know about how he was doing. Denny stayed until his joints made the winter work impossible, and then he moved to his daughter's place in the county east, and they had a farewell supper that was simple and not sentimental in the way Denny required things to not be sentimental, and she shook his hand when he left because that was also what he required, and watched him go with the particular feeling of losing something that has been quietly essential. She hired 2 new hands over the course of the second year, a woman named Bess, which raised several eyebrows in Redstone Valley, and which Elara found she had lost the capacity to care about, and a man named Torres who had more experience with high country cattle work than anyone she'd interviewed, and who turned out to be worth considerably more than she was paying him, which she corrected after 3 months. The ranch grew. Not dramatically, she was too careful for dramatic growth, and the territory was too uncertain for it anyway. But consistently, in the way that things grow when they're managed with clear eyes and steady hands, and the willingness to say the true thing even when the true thing is uncomfortable. The North Watercourse ran clean, the kitchen garden produced more than they needed, and the surplus went to a trade arrangement with 2 neighboring families that benefited everyone without anyone having to call it charity. The South Pasture expanded by a section purchased from a family that was moving east, purchased at a fair price after a negotiation that was honest on both sides. And in the evenings, in the kitchen with the lamp and the account books and the fence surveys, 2 imperfect people who had come to each other through practicality and stayed through something that had grown underneath the practicality without being planned. They worked. They argued sometimes. They were quiet together often. They learned slowly the specific shape of each other. Not the ideal version, not the version you imagine before you know someone, but the actual version, with its difficulties and its particular graces. There is something she understood in those years in that kitchen that she had not understood before she came to Redstone Valley. She had believed most of her life that the judgment passed on her, the laughing, the assessing look, the decision made in 30 seconds about what she was worth, said something true about the world, that the world was accurately measuring her and finding her deficient, and that the correct response was to work harder to prove the measurement wrong. What she came to understand was that the measurement itself was the problem, not her, the measurement. The assumption that a woman's value was a thing that could be assessed at a glance, like livestock at market, and that the assessment was permanent. It wasn't true. It had never been true. It was just a thing people said because saying it was easier than looking properly, and looking properly required time and attention that most people preferred to spend on other things. Martha Greer had looked at her for 30 seconds and decided. Colton had looked at her for 6 weeks before he started to see what was actually there. The difference between those 2 ways of looking was not intelligence. Martha Greer was not a stupid woman. It was willingness. The willingness to keep the question open a little longer, to let the evidence come in before reaching the verdict. She could not change the people who refused to look properly. She had stopped trying. But she could be the kind of evidence that made it harder for them to hold their conclusions with complete confidence, and she could build something real enough that the people willing to look had something worth seeing. The woman nobody wanted became, in time, the woman people came to when something needed thinking through. Not because she had made herself indispensable in the calculating way Aldrich used dependence, but because she was genuinely useful and honest, and because she showed up, which sounds simple and isn't. Ruth Henderson brought her problems with the county assessor's new grazing fee structure. August Pell's daughter came to her when she was considering a business arrangement that had some suspicious language in it, and Elara read it and found the clause, and the daughter went home with the information she needed to protect herself. Clara Briggs's husband got his watercourse question answered and fixed the eastern boundary problem and sent over a sack of their best potatoes that fall as thanks, which Elara accepted because declining it would have been its own form of condescension. She was not the leader of anything. She did not run the valley or organize its people or stand at the center of its social architecture. She was a woman on a ranch in the Northern Territory who paid attention and thought carefully and spoke plainly and helped when she could and asked for help when she needed it. That was the thing she had gotten wrong in the beginning, the belief that proving herself required something dramatic, something large enough to be undeniable. The blizzard had been dramatic. The legal letters had been significant. But neither of those things was what built the life she was building. It was the dishes in the first hour, the account books at the kitchen table, the stones wrapped in cloth for a man pulled from ice water, the question asked at the right moment, the space held while someone worked through something they needed to work through. Strength, she had learned, not taught, learned in her body and her bones through the specific long education of this territory, was not the dramatic thing. It was the continuous thing. The thing you brought to every ordinary day, not because someone was watching or because it would be recognized, but because the work was real, and the people were real, and the land was real, and those things deserved your full attention, regardless of whether anyone was going to applaud you for giving it. On a morning in the fall of their third year, she stood on the porch of the Ray Ranch in the early light, her coffee going warm in her hands, watching the north pasture come alive in the first frost-edged sun of the season. And she was not thinking about Harrisburg or the rented room or the things her mother had told her or the laughter on the main street of Redstone Valley. She was thinking about whether the south pasture rotation needed to shift in the spring, and about the letter she needed to write to Fetch, and about the way Colton's shoulder had been bothering him and whether she could get him to stop pretending it wasn't. She was thinking about what needed doing. The same as always. The mountains were enormous and indifferent in the early light, the way they were every morning. The cattle were moving in the pasture below. The kitchen garden, going dormant now for winter, had given them more than they'd needed and would come back in spring. The watercourse ran clean behind the ridge. She drank her coffee. She went inside. She started on the day.